And I, William the Blind, do likewise love to grapple in the hold of history, seeking in bygone darkness certain pale glimmers which are o'er insubstantial to be spied in today's sunlight. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I'm talking about the third dream in William T Vollmann's 7 Dreams septology. It's called ARGALL, the true story of John Smith and Pocahontas. I was really excited about this one because it has to do with the Virginia colony. And I myself am a Virginian, even though I'm living here in North Carolina, which actually used to be Virginia. And so in school, I grew up learning all about John Smith and Pocahontas and Powhatan and Attamatomkin and John Rolfe and so on, the Jamestown colony. So I was really excited to see what Vollmann had dug up and turned over. And as I was flipping through my notes from the previous 2 dreams, I noticed that in the ice shirt, I had really highlighted this question of, do we carry our landscapes within us? A lot of the critical thinking that's brought into these 7 dreams is William T. Vollmann observing how landscape, how geography has shaped our lives, and whether that is something that can be passed down as if it's encoded in the human genome. And so for myself, for a Virginian who grew up learning about all these places and grew up in Virginia, I felt that this dream, above all the others, is something to which I could really relate and really take to heart. Of course, by the end of the dream, I wasn't exactly proud to be a Virginian, or at least proud of the history of my forebears. It's rather unfortunate. But I don't know if I've talked about this in my previous 2 videos for the first 2 dreams, but Vollmann writes this through a narrator who is a persona called William the Blind. This is such a brilliant ruse, such a brilliant mouthpiece. William the Blind is this omnipresent, fluid, immortal metamorph who guides us throughout times and places and settings and personages and events and books and dreams, of course. And you'll note that there is the use of we, that collective first person that starts to emerge. William the Blind starts off using I, but relates to whatever perspective he's giving at the time. And this happens across the dreams. And what this is indicative of is just how immersive Vollmann is when he takes on a writing project. No matter what it is, he's going to completely immerse himself in every aspect of the subject. And so you've got William T. Vollmann, the writer, here sort of in the middle of this spoke, like the spokes of a wheel. So Vollmann is here at the hub, and you've got this spoke that goes out to William the Blind. But then these other spokes that go from William the Blind and William T. Vollmann to each of the characters. So if it's Captain John Smith, if it's ARGALL, if it's Powhatan, if it's Pocahontas, then you've got the novelist, the researcher, the historian, the poet, the travel writer, the philosopher, and the critic. Somehow, William T. Vollmann's prose in these dreams, pretty much everything he's written, is a synthesis of all these different roles that he plays. What he has done is he has taken the writing and research process and brought it into the novel proper. And he's made an art form of his entire embodiment of what it takes to bring together one of these books. He also proves to be an artist who can discern and tease out those hidden connections between all these different modes of observation and thought. He sort of helps bubble them up to the surface, out from under what he'll call that Virginian ooze. And I love this. I love the fact that he brings in the obvious thrill, the love and adoration he has for the research process and for reading in books themselves. He brings it into this novel. In the sort of prologue, he, through William the Blind, talks about how he went about acquiring the texts of John Smith's from which he culled so much of this book. I'm going to read it in its entirety, at least just this subsection. That was why I coveted those burgundied volumes from the very first, for death assailed me. On one of his blank charters, my birth certificate, he'd already penned my name. He'd come a-soldiering and a-sailing to find me. He'd come a-riding to smell me out with his hounds of time. How long could I hide? Someday I'd reach my December, which is the heel of the year. If only Captain Fortune would haven me within his slip-cased works. Let death hound me then. I'd be Virginia'd safe into words. Not myself any more true, but signature of myself, as the empty sepulchre doth signify Christ. The book's the thing. Words live beyond life. Word to word, I sought comfort from sweet John Smith. I issued counter charters and licenses of my own. I called upon vendors of the word. Just as in the convoy of the first ship to descry land must shoot off her ordnance and raise the gladsome flag, so I commanded. Ought every bookseller to telephone me as soon as those 3 books came to light? But since I was no captain, they stayed out of patience, or else, afraid to attract death's notice, they ducked my commission like foolish fretting creepers. Out of print, they said. Tush! Don't we all go out of print? Even this very dream must someday get waterlogged and give over voyaging. And you, right honorable, he refers to us, the reader, as right honorable. 4 centuries hence, where will you be? Down, deep down, twixt Gravesend and Virginia swirls many a watery grave. But 3 harquebus shots away, in one of those tiny cellar bookstores in the chitterlings of Manhattan's Upper East Side, the pipe-smoking owner, lifting his arm as if to ward off the gazes of tacksmen, emerged himself to try. And 2 months and $200 later, for I had neither gold nobles, nor French louis, nor Spanish ducatoons, I happened to be writing a dream about salvages and crow spirits of New York. That is, Fathers and Crows, the previous dream. When the telephone sang, I'm Captain Fortune and your ship's in harbor. That voice, it did most strangely remind me of a waterman's whisper. And when I looked around me with proper sincerity, I saw that I was back in Gravesend, meaning he just jumped back into the writing of this 3rd dream from the writing of the 2nd dream, because, as he said in other places, he writes all this stuff at the same time. He alternates between all this. It's really incredible. I saw that I was back in Gravesend. After donning my accustomed funereal spirit, I shouldered a pickaxe in case any of the cobwebs I was likely to meet had fossilized. Then I recited the Anglican burial service and descended into that subterranean bed of typeset virtue off 81st Street, where the bookseller, himself now buried as I hear, or did he but go bankrupt, stood ready with the spoils, my complete works of Captain John Smith, duly shrouded in brown paper in a cardboard sarcophagus which our Redeemer had postmarked from North Carolina, bastard latecomer of a state which was but lately, 1662, Virginian territory. This is representative of what I love so much about these 7 Dreams books, is that Vollmann interweaves the past and the present. And so he connects a continuum to implicate us all. Even though he's writing about the present moment and his trials and tribulations trying to get his hands on the complete works of John Smith, he's writing it through William the Blind in the manner of someone of the Jamestown colony speaking, just like Thomas Pynchon and John Barth in Mason and Dixon and the Sotweed Factor, respectively. Here, Vollmann affects an Elizabethan tilting into the King James, just as the historical switch in monarchs happened. He speaks through that voice to us, and it's addictive. And it goes beyond just the speaking voice. The actual way the text is displayed on these pages also mimics its historical setting. And as I was reading this, I kept thinking about how difficult this typesetting would be. And sure enough, in the acknowledgments page, the very last thing it says is, "I am grateful to Carla Bolt for her painstaking typographical work." Yes, painstaking indeed, but because of the labors of Vollmann and people like Carla Bolt, we get to experience this incredibly immersive journey. As with the other dreams, again, there are copious, sumptuous, exorbitant notes. Whenever you see italics on a page, that probably signals a note that's in the back of the book. And you'll see just how much research went into this. The way that this narrative is set up is we start in Gravesend or County Kent in England with John Smith, and we sort of follow John Smith as he's trying to make a splash. We watch as a couple settlements and colonizations and scouting ventures utterly fail. And then eventually we move from England to Jamestown with John Smith, and we live with him through his trials there. Most of us know, at least superficially, the story. I know that growing up in Virginia, I heard the story of Pocahontas and John Smith many times, and how John Smith got captured and Powhatan was getting ready to have him killed, and Pocahontas intervened. For some reason in my mind, it's funny how memory works. I, for some reason, thought that Pocahontas and John Smith got married, but in fact they did not. John Rolfe ended up coming and marrying Pocahontas, and they brought her back to England, where she was just like people from England that went to Virginia died of contagions and parasites that their bodies, their immune systems weren't ready for. So the same thing pretty much happened when they brought Princess Pocahontas there to England. So it was really nice to get a better, deeper, more detailed view of the story settled properly in my mind. Then poor John Smith, he is pretty much dismissed by all the powers that be. And then we get this figure, Samuel Argall, who could very well have been a sort of Ahab figure. He's a figure of whom not much is known. He's this dark figure who remains on the edge of history, and Vollmann is at pains to color in his life and his sinister presence. But we get that second half of the story where the colonists come with manpower and just overthrow all the tribes. And then in the same way that he does with his previous two dreams, after the dream proper ends, and it'll tell you that here ends the third dream, then we get all these further history of, and we see what the fate of John Smith was, what the fate of Argall was, what the fate of the different tribes, the different native tribes are. What were they doing there? We get a clue. He'd erect and fortify a town twixt the Susquehannocks and Canada to interdict the French trade. He'd find China if it was to be found. The aspirations of John Smith and other colonists coming from England were to find a passageway in the South Seas to try to find a trade route to China. But they also wanted to get in there in between the Spanish down in Florida and the French up in Canada and preempt and interdict themselves into those trade routes and capture that whole swathe from New England down to just above Florida for themselves. And it's interesting to see how, just as all of these European powers, Spain, France, England, were at war with one another, driven by greed, so too were the native tribes at war with each other. Vollmann does a good job of balancing out history in such a way to where he's not covering up or making excuses for the things that happen, but just showing that it's beyond just skin color or the climate or the terrain from which we all came. It's more than just Europeans versus natives. There's something broken and pernicious in the human heart. Now this Virginia's an Ireland of infinitely greater worth. For once taken and secured, she'll supply all our wants for ages. Moreover, as the Spaniards have proved, there's treasure here, and I'm assured we're now in grappling reach of China. So the other thing, not just inserting themselves in there and heading off the French and the Spaniards from the territory in between the two of them, and not just finding that route to China, but gold. They were certain that they would find gold in Virginia. And in a way, they did, but it was in the form of tobacco. Moreover, tobacco's price had swollen to 59 pounds sterling for 500 pounds. For the doctors of London town could no longer deny how sovereign a healer was that herb against ulcers, the clap, melancholy, and such like ills. 'Twas a considerable annoyance to the Spanish trade, and therefore a blow struck against popishness. Also, we have to bring in the factions between the Catholics and the Protestants. All hail King Tobacco! God speed you, my lord. And I don't know how to pronounce this, Vipawak. It's a native word for the plant. Even young lads and lassies in Lincoln Town now smoked pipes of it. Such was the craze. By 1696, it would be down to £1.75. Maester Rolfe was then sitting safely amongst the celestial angels. So furthermore, even within Protestantism, there's a vine of, or a thread of, Calvinism. And so in that thought, at that time, in the time of Milton, the concept of Calvin's predestination made the Protestants seek out signs that they were favored by God and chosen as one of the predestined. And one of the main ways they did that was to see if they were getting financially blessed. And so when it says that Maester Rolfe, or John Rolfe, was then sitting safely amongst the celestial angels, I think that's what we're pointing to, is that root of Calvinist doctrine within the Protestants. So you can split this thing, or in the data world, we call it slicing. You can slice all these data points in so many different ways. The complexities are endless. The marketing copy on this Penguin paperback reminds us that this is one of America's first interracial couples, or as they call it, first interracial romances. And so there's a note very close to the end that says, hence no one even knows whether he remained alive after 1658, by which time it had coincidentally become illegal for Englishmen in Virginia to marry with Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians, such as his late mother. And so that's talking about Francis Rolfe, who was the son to John Rolfe and Pocahontas. Just chilling to read these types of things, and that this is fact. Also reminded that North Virginia was what we now call New England. So Virginia was a wide swathe of territory. Vollmann is never far from humor. It's typically very wry humor, but it hits nonetheless. And I love how he superimposes the present and the past. And you'll get a little aside from his travels to do research like this. One of her many purple biographies cites a tradition that Pocahontas died in the last house on Stone Street. Bob, Esther, and I strolled there, but it was only a McDonald's restaurant. No wonder she died, said Bob. The protagonist of this dream of mine is ooze. Ooze is a substance that underlies all of Virginia. Here and forever called Ozymandias, the king. At the beginning of another section, William the Blind likes to talk to us directly every now and then, and it's a good way to continue to pull us in. But this is how he refers to us in one section. He says, although, sweet reader, and then parenthetically, thou redeemer of my mortgage. And finally, we get this humorous footnote. Unlike most authors who demand a long and weary perusal from beginning to end, I never forget the convenience of my readers. My books are unfailingly brief, and I never swerve from my point. Hence my titles, misses, and blind languishments of words. This is done in winking sarcasm. Vollmann reads and absorbs so much material, just in general, let alone when he's focused on a project, that he includes a quote or an epigraph or epigram at the beginning of the book proper and the beginning of every single section. You can tell this stuff is just pouring out of him. And at the beginning of a chapter called The Grammar of Emperors, he puts two choice excerpts from two different books side by side to juxtapose and show this commonality of cruelty and violence between the two races. So the first one is from a book called Pocahontas by Grace Steele Woodward. To understand Pocahontas, one must first understand the Powhatan culture from which she emerged, a culture of dark superstition and devil worship, a culture of easy cruelty and primitive social accomplishments. Although Pocahontas was exceptional within this culture, she was not immune to it. And then we get Christopher Hill's Change and Continuity in 17th century England. In the cruel and brutal world of mid-17th century England, men were hanged, drawn, and quartered for having the wrong ideas. An elderly clergyman was tortured and sentenced to death for having in his drawer a sermon which had never been preached and which he had no intention of publishing. One of the discoveries that Vollmann talks about having made early in his preparations for this Seven Dream series of North American landscapes and flashpoints of the history of the continent is the idea of the kenning, which to ken something could mean to understand it, and that's used a lot throughout this book. But a kenning is also basically a synecdoche or a metaphor for something else. And so he employs his own. For example, we get this with Brutus, he doth troll the ale bowl to sweet John's memory. And this ale bowl that he's talking about is what we know as the Potomac. I'm just going to now point out a lot of different places where the writing itself struck me, because on top of all this research and all these different artistic elements, the writing is just so good in these books. No, the Smiths have always continued loyal to their betters, which goes not disremembered by him who now sits outside in his riding boots, stroking a pair of hunting dogs on their heads, his finger tracing the long, shallow skull grooves beneath the fur as the hounds sigh in pleasured squirmfulness. This Peregrine Barty fellow owns both a watch which chimes and a soul bursting with secular humors. The sun's in Gemini and the queen's in ecstasy. 'Tis war of the clock and supper time, feast time of a bloody century like all the others. 'Tis likewise the very year when Virginia opens her womb to be delivered of Pocahontas. Sweet reader, passenger of this ungainly word barge of mine. This book he refers to as an ungainly word barge. And you'll notice he's also keeping the theme of the setting and the events, the voyaging from one continent to another. The river narrows until icicle-hung trees are raking their bow on either side. A milk skin of ice crackles around them. Now branches clasp each other across the water, and Sweet John sets the men to work with hatchets. Smith and Casson on the port side, Robinson and Emery on the starboard, and the troops are sniffling, hewing listlessly. In the church at Willoughby, there's a little hatchway inside the big door, which opens only for weddings, christenings, and funerals. So it is with fate's innermost door. Let's pretend it now doth gape for this joyous wedding with Pocahontas, which will admit John Smith to glory at last. This is something he does several times in this book that I noticed. What he does is when he wants to use a metaphor to elevate something that he's seeing at the present time in the historical setting of the novel, he'll grasp at something that at first seems totally unrelated and then relate it. And usually it's the architecture here of a church at Willoughby that he's seeing during his travels in the 1990s or whenever. And he connects it in a way that's also unexpected. His figurative writing basically is full on at the height of his abilities in this book. Powhatan's country is flat and marshy, with many bearded, grizzled pines casting their pinish pall. Powhatan's country smells of ooze, pine needles, and dust. A most breezily blue-gray afternoon it is, and the river streams. Leaves stream as laundry will someday stream, 4 centuries later in the era of Rick's General Store. He strode to the bow and stared ahead. His eyes sipped weed froth and weed foam from atop a pondful of dark swamp ale. Now it came spring at Jamestown, and the waters rose very great, covering the grass with darkness, which sparkled with innumerable question marks. You can see the grass bent from the weight of the rain and those little drips that look like the point. And I'll leave you with this one about the figure whose name is the title of this book. ARGALL, ARGALL, ARGALL. It's spelled 3 different ways. One thing Vollmann does for more verisimilitude of the early 17th century is to use different spellings for the same name interchangeably. History's instrument, America's votary, Pocahontas's muster master. I already swore you'd die rich. But where are you? What are you? You glimmer, and again you're gone. Meanwhile, your atoms dwell within us all. As anyone can verify this very day by examining your signature, which lives circuitous and doubled, the S in Samuel, grown spiky with treacherous vines, o'ergrowing all its channels, which have already narrowed like unto muddy creeks in grassland. As for the A, that's a true masterpiece of lines, as I must confess. We can see up its roots, which resemble spidery brooms, but then our vision rapidly gets lost in its excruciating tangles, from which progress hides within the dark, sideways pit of an alligator's eye. As it doth say in the book of Proverbs, all the ways of man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weigheth the spirits. Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. Glory be, ARGALL hath enacted himself. And he gives us a picture of Samuel Argall's signature there so that you can look at it and then see how Vollmann interprets it pictorially. It's absolutely brilliant writing. Now, when he brings in the present as he's seeing it, and the travel writer in him and the poet in him are merging to construct prose like that, that for me, that just almost makes me giddy. And I wondered to myself how he would wrap up ARGALL, because the way he wrapped up the previous dream, Fathers and Crows, with this superimposition of past and present that starts to dissolve into one another, it lit my hair on fire. And he does not disappoint here, and he turns to a different way of doing it. And what he does is he gives us an almost final section called Further History of Virginia, 1996. And he talks about how, as he was traveling from Florida to Virginia, he saw these different signs, and he includes the text from these different signs he saw. And some of them will just say Waffle House and Holiday Inn. But then you'll see things that resonate more with everything you've just read, such as, if you want to save money, you're headed in the right direction. Indian River Fruit. Indian Moccasins. Then he's got Welcome to North Carolina. Indian Moccasins. JR Cigarettes. World's largest. I've passed that thing so many times. So Vollmann was driving a mere 20 minutes away from me. Lost Colony. 8 miles. Tobacco Barn, Welcome to Virginia, James River, Jamestown Settlement, and then he puts some space in between and he captures Pocahontas Street. Sort of a chilling and brilliant ending. There's so much more I could say about this third dream, but I'm going to go ahead and cut it here. The next one is The Dying Grass. Please don't miss out on this great literature. The 7 Dreams, this is William T. Vollmann's In Search of Lost Time, whereas Rising Up and Rising Down is his decline and fall of the Roman Empire.